This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. 1 in 5 Americans will get a skin cancer diagnosis in their lifetime. That's according to the American Academy of Dermatology. You can do many things to reduce risk, like seeking shade when the sun's rays are strongest or wearing sun-protective clothing. And of course, there's always sunscreen. But the summertime staple has recently come under attack. Hear more about that later. Joining us now is Stacey Mann. She's a senior development manager at the American Cancer Society and a melanoma advocate living in Milford, Connecticut. She's also a skin cancer survivor. Stacey, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, you can join the conversation. Let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Stacey, can you start this conversation off by telling us about your journey and how you received your diagnosis?
My journey, unbeknownst to me, began at the age of 16 when I decided I was going to tan for prom. This was in the 90s. Every girl was tanning to look beautiful for their prom. So I started my tanning journey at the age of 16. And from that point on, I just became so addicted to that glowy skin. Fast forward to around the age of 30, I was noticing some large age spots on my face. And I went to my dermatologist, and I'm very freckly. I'm English, so I'm freckly, but I was getting those large, like liver spots that you would see on people in their 80s and 90s.
Right.
And I went to my dermatologist and I said, I'm getting these spots. Can we please laser them? And he said, yes. So he went to laser my face, and there's just one spot that was questionable. It was like a large freckle, but it had red underneath it. So he biopsied it, and it came back as some type of an autoimmune lesion, nothing really to be concerned about. So it made sense at the time for an autoimmune diagnosis because I had other health things going on in my life at the time. So that was around 2011, right around my wedding. I was seeing this. I was seeing in wedding photos the just age spots on my face, and I knew something wasn't wrong because I'm 30, looking at other girls' skin my age. I'm like, this isn't normal. So
Right.
my dermatologist, we started to navigate taking care of it, but I would laser, and this spot would immediately keep coming back. And we would laser and it would come back, and it would laser and come back. And this was a couple of years of doing this, and I was getting so frustrated. So I went for a second opinion. And the second opinion was the same thing. It's a lupus type lesion on my face. So he was injecting with cortisone, and then I would do the laser and the cortisone, and this was still coming back. And I'm saying to myself, why? We're in modern times, and this shouldn't be living on my face when we have so much technology and lasers and just medicine that I shouldn't be living with this. It just doesn't make sense. So I was treating it with a topical cream and the laser and the cortisone and nothing. And so I finally was fed up. And in 2019, I decided I was going to switch dermatologists. And I went to a new practice. I explained my whole story to her. Meanwhile, this had been 8 years that had passed. So this had been on my face for 8 years. And she said, we'll just biopsy it. I will call you in 2 weeks. And she called me the next day. And it was an out-of-body experience. She says, you have melanoma. It never fully registered to me that it was happening to me. But she was amazing. And she said, I'm going to send all of your records to Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. And my journey started from there. So I was diagnosed in 2019. I'm celebrating my 5-year cancerversary this year.
Oh, congratulations. That's a
Thank you.
big deal. Well, and I mean, so you just described your experience hearing the news for the first time as a very out of body, and the fact that you've been going at this for 8 years, that's a really long time trying to figure out what's going on. And the fact that you asked a question and ultimately got an answer, what was going through your mind when you found out about this? Because you did go through a really long and pretty arduous process of getting that answer at the end.
The entire experience truly did feel like an out of body experience. And I think for a lot of people, we it's a coping mechanism. Like, this doesn't feel like it's happening to me. It's, to this day, never felt like it's really happened to me, even though my face is disfigured permanently from this ordeal. But it's just, yeah, like I can't explain that feeling, but
Mhm.
it was a lot.
Right. And I think you shared something earlier that I feel like many of us have kind of gone through a very similar experience in our upbringing. You've talked about tanning earlier in life. So your journey,
Yes.
in some ways started at 16. So can you talk about, how did you start that practice and why do you think you got hooked?
Um, I started tanning at 16, like I said, for prom, but I was so vampire pasty,
Mm.
and I got that first glow and I was like, oh my gosh, like, it triggered something mentally in my brain that almost switched on like this addictive trait. And I see so many women doing this where it's called tanorexia. And I
Mm.
know that's like an Urban Dictionary term, but it's an
Sure.
actual thing. So if you're suffering from some type of an addiction, this was a tanning addiction, full blown. I started at the age of 16 and I stopped tanning around when I discovered this lesion on my face. So around the age of 33. So
Mm.
for all that time, I was tanning, and I am the poster child
Mm.
for tanning causes melanoma.
Well, and when you say tanorexia, as you mentioned, it's an
Hmm.
urban dictionary sort of definition, but very much real, very much out
Hmm.
there. What does that mean to you to have that defined?
It's I wish more people spoke about it.
Mm.
It definitely exists. And, to be truthful here, I still suffer from it. When
Mm.
we're in the summer months and I
Right.
want to go sit on the beach, I have to be under an umbrella. But the minute, like, if I get a few freckles, it's something in my brain. So
Mm.
it really is an addiction. I've never spoken to a therapist or anything about it. I mean, I really manage my time in the sun and I take every precaution that I possibly can now. And I've been doing so for the last 15 years. Um, but is, it really is an addiction, and it really is hard to break. And I still to this day struggle with it.
Right. And because it's in some ways, I think it's such a generational thing too. The way you were exposed to it, the idea of doing that at 16 for prom. Do you think there was anything that could have changed your behavior?
And I think it's a generational thing. And in the 90s, we did not have any of the information that we have today.
Right.
And I will say there's going to be a gap. And I think the newer generation is obsessed with their skincare and their sunscreen. And um, we're going to see people with less skin cancer as our generations move on. But I feel like I'm the last generation of people that baked in the sun. I
Mm.
grew up with SPF 2. Um,
Right.
which
Right.
people today would be shocked. SPF 2, what does that even do? Yes, SPF 2. We didn't have sunscreens. We didn't have any of the things that we have today. And the 90s was just such a different time than where we are now. So it's a generational thing.
Right. And we definitely want to get into that further on in this conversation and also talk about how we view skin cancer and the seriousness of it. But you did mention earlier that you've had to have multiple opinions to find out that you have
Hmm.
melanoma and you've had major surgeries to remove that on your face.
Hmm.
What did that look like for you?
That was incredibly scary and daunting. And doctors really do not let you in on kind of what you're in for. The whole experience of a wide local excision on your face is incredibly traumatic.
Mm.
It is not to be taken lightly. Um, I had two wide local excisions to meet the margins, and then I had to have reconstructive plastic surgery to fill. I pretty much had my entire cheek taken off, the buccal portion of my cheek, which is where people have that indentation. on their cheeks. I had that whole part removed, and then I had to have my entire neck lifted up to cover the gaping hole in my face. And doctors don't prepare you. No one prepares you. You can go down to Google rabbit hole, which I don't advise anyone to do that. But it is so traumatic and so stressful, and the PTSD that you have from that surgery and a cancer diagnosis lives with you for the rest of your life. And so there are many women I've connected with in this community that we have something called scanxiety, where when you are diagnosed with skin cancer, you are getting your skin checked every 3 months for so many years, and then you kind of graduate up. But there is such a fear instilled in you once you have that cancer diagnosis. Not to be on my soapbox a bit, but skin cancer is way more serious than people take it. I am living proof that I've had a terrible surgery. I may not have had chemo or radiation. Those were options for me, but I decided to go the surgery route because it's 100% effective. But you live with that for the rest of your life. So when I see people baking in the sun like they do, I cringe. And I even have friends who still go tanning. My friend just tanned for a wedding, and it's like, I do my own advocacy, but I don't personally preach to people. It's your body, you do what you want. But it's hard.
Right. No, absolutely. And because you've had such an experience with this in so many ways that I think a lot of us can't even begin to imagine. And I did want to ask you, if you thought skin cancer isn't taken as seriously as other forms of cancer, but I think you've already answered that through your response. But I do want to sort of follow up with that too. It's changed your life physically in so many ways. It's also changed your life mentally in also many other ways. So did it change the way you have conversations with your friends or family who, you just gave an example of, a friend just went to a tanning booth for a wedding, and there's a lot of cringing going on, but where's the line of, as a friend, I want to tell you, but I don't, you don't want to like cross that line. How has that changed for you?
I do a lot of generalized advocating, and I have made an impact on so many people's lives, even people I don't know, even just through social media. I've kind of created a platform where I can educate people in my area. Like I said, I never called that friend out, but she knew I was upset with her. So I think I made my point when I asked her. I was like, "Oh, I love your spray tan," and she's like, "I didn't spray tan," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh."
Okay, right.
It's a problem with us in the United States. I don't know why this culture is so obsessed with darker skin as opposed to other cultures like we were discussing earlier. So tanning for your wedding, tanning for your prom. Why do we have to tan for special events? And there's so many other options these days that are fabulous. There's great products on the market to do your little self tan. So, but we're still obsessed.
And with the culture too, which is something that we will be talking about later on in this conversation, is how did it change your relationship with tanning? Because you did mention earlier, you love the sun. Sun has played such a huge part in your lives, and it is beneficial. But how has that changed the way you go out in the sun?
So before tanning, I was a vampire physically. After tanning, I got melanoma, and now I've become that vampire again. So it's wide brim hats, UPF clothing, the best sunscreen. I will spend the money on really good sunscreen because it works. I limit my time in the sun now. I will say I am a diehard beach girl. I love the beach so much. I love the water, but I will always have my UPF umbrella and I will be sitting under it. And I take many precautions. It took a while for me not to be afraid of the sun. I think we build up to that after our after our journeys, it's been 5 years, and I just take all the precautions. And, all the people around me that are very close to me, if I'm out to dinner or not out to dinner, if we're out to lunch and we're sitting outside, people are very, oh, do you want to do you need to sit in the shade? Like, my friends are all like amazing in that sense. Like, they think about me and the sun, and knowing that I don't want to be in it, though I love it and I miss it. It's part of who I am now. It's changed me completely.
Well, and you mentioned sunscreen. So later this hour, we will be talking more about sunscreen and also the misinformation that we've been seeing. And there are some people who allege that it's causing cancer or that homemade sunscreen is effective. So how do you respond to that?
My gosh, please do not make your homemade sunscreen. There is so much misinformation on TikTok, and it's maddening. Like I said, I'm in a community of 5 really strong melanoma survivors across the country. And if we could go toe to toe with these people spreading misinformation, like everything out there's always going to be misinformation. It's up to you to be your own best advocate and make those educated decisions. I think that one sunscreen story about benzene being a carcinogen has really spiraled and spiraled and spiraled. And this is the world we live in today.
Right.
But you really need to take a step back, do your research. If you really are very serious about sunscreen, do your research. I will say I personally prefer mineral sunscreens. They sit on your skin as opposed to absorbing in your skin. I've always, my entire life, had a reaction to chemical sunscreens. That's just my sensitive skin. And I never knew what that was until just recently, when we're starting to actually gain information about different types of sunscreens. So I gravitate toward mineral. And I just find things that work for me. It's not a one sunscreen fits all. You really kind of have to try them out. So if you're very serious about protecting yourself, you might want to try several and see what works. Because I know a lot of people don't like wearing sunscreen. I understand it can be white cast, it can be thick, it can be greasy, but there are several new and upcoming brands that are changing formulas, and they're so much better than they were even a couple of years ago.
Well, and I think we are kind of on the flip side of things now, because mentioning earlier in the 90s, we don't have a lot of information about sunscreen or sun protection, but now we almost have too much information and we're talking about misinformation. Are you worried that this might cause less sunscreen use? Is that something that you're seeing at all?
Yeah, I am actually. I really, it's, people just don't take care of their skin. And one of the things I advocate is your skin is your largest organ. Please take care of it. And people are so just kind of reckless with sun. You get your heart checked every year. You get your physical every year. Like, if something was wrong with those, you would take care of it. So why not take a moment, find a sunscreen, and wear it?
And I feel like that's part of your final thoughts already, but we've got about a minute here left. But still want to ask you if there's anything we haven't touched on that you would like to share with our listeners.
Please take care of your skin. Find a sunscreen that works for you. If you have skin cancer, or if you're going through a journey like this, it's so common. There's, look into UPF clothing, wear a wide brim hat. If you're going to the beach, I especially ask that you wear a wide brim hat, because the sun reflects off the water, reflects off the sand. So if you're just wearing a baseball cap, you're not protecting the sides of your face. Think about when you're sitting in your car all day, every day, wear that sunscreen. I noticed that when I was looking at the sun damage on my face, it was all on the left side from driving. So just please be sun safe, wear your sunscreen, wear your UPF clothing, and really, really consider thinking that your skin is your largest organ. And if you are going through this journey of skin cancer, you are always going to be stronger than you think, and you've got this, and you will get through it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that list with us, Stacey. You've been listening
Hmm.
to Stacey Mann, who's a senior development manager at the American Cancer Society and melanoma advocate. Thanks, Stacey, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And coming up next, we talk about why sunscreen is under attack and have experts with us to help us better understand how we should use this familiar summer staple. And how often do you use sunscreen? Inez on Facebook shared with us, I remember going on vacation to the tropics in the 90s. The first 2 or 3 days, we used SPF 15, then we went down to SPF 5 for the rest of the vacation. Thanks so much, Inez, for sharing your experience with us. You can also join the conversation, listeners, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Every summer, we're reminded to wear our sunscreen. For me, just saying the word brings me right back to the beach, lathering up before jumping in the water. In fact, I have sunscreen on as we speak. Sadly, we're not broadcasting to you live from the beach today, but maybe one day that'll happen. But being at the beach or not, sunscreen has been coming under fire lately. In early July, Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal pushed the Food and Drug Administration to approve more effective ingredients in sunscreens. In countries like Japan and France, sunscreens better protect people from UV rays than those used here in the US. And on top of that, some high profile social media influencers are spreading misinformation about sunscreen on TikTok, including that it causes cancer. So today, we have brought in a few experts to break down sunscreen for us. Dr. Kelly Olino is an assistant professor of surgical oncology at Yale School of Medicine. Dr. Olino, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning to you, and also to Caroline Hopkins, who is a health and science reporter who recently reported on sunscreen for the New York Times. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And we are all excited for both of you to be here with us to help us understand sunscreen a little better. And also for our listeners, let us know how you're protecting yourself from the sun this summer. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Dr. Olino, I want to start with you. Before we get into everything about sunscreen and skin cancer, can you respond to what you've heard from Stacey? Is her story common?
Her story is very common. I think I tell them all the time, I'm happy to see you in clinic, but no one's ever happy to come and see me. So much of what I do during the first time that I'm meeting a patient is trying to give them really tailored information to their skin cancer. We do a lot of education. In the advertisement, they just mentioned Katharine Hepburn, who I love, but I always put a comparison between Audrey and Katharine and say, channel your inner Audrey when you can. Younger patients don't get it as well as some of my older patients, but it becomes life-changing for many patients. And I talk to my patients a lot about Stacey's fears, and we have conversations about we're not going to live in fear of the sun, but we're going to figure out a new relationship with the sun. And we go over a lot of the things that Stacey had really brought up with things that you can change while still maintaining some really otherwise good, healthy behaviors.
Well, and I think that new relationship with the sun and the weather, really, it feels like it's the theme for this conversation. And I think many of us have a personal connection to that. And you also have a personal connection to this topic. So can you tell us what attracted you to this field of medicine in the first place?
Yeah, so my background is that of a European background, but my mom's side of the family is all of Irish descent. And I would say my first experiences with melanoma are actually quite personal. So personal, in fact, that some of the groundbreaking immunotherapy that I had in my hand, that I was working on in the lab doing research, that I couldn't use on my cousin who died from melanoma. I grew up in Queens in New York, right near Rockaway Beach. And, I have a lot of relatives whose life goal was to see if they could get their freckles to grow together. And that unfortunately did not actually do well with my family. So It really was something that shaped me while I was still in my medical training, and actually shapes me every single week when I'm meeting a new patient.
Well, and you mentioned that Stacey's journey and experience is actually fairly common. So, and you're having these conversations a lot with your own patients. Are we actually seeing the rate of skin cancer increasing?
So the rates of cancer are increasing. And some of that is actually due to really good work done by dermatologists and primary care doctors. So I do think that we're detecting more of the skin cancers. I will say that for very aggressive skin cancer, some like melanoma, this has actually been the first time in history where we look at the survival has actually improved for the first time ever. And a lot of that is because in advanced stages that we have these revolutionary treatments, most of them centered around something called immune therapy.
Well, and we've been talking about melanoma, and as Stacey's described earlier, and you yourself just mentioned now that skin cancer is common. Um, it is a serious diagnosis. Can you talk about what are some of the different types of skin cancer? Because there are several, and they all present in different ways. What should we look out for?
So the most common skin cancers are actually squamous cell cancers and basal cell carcinomas. Many of those will be fleshy colored, will be raised. Some of them can just look like raised dry patches. And those by far are the most common cancers worldwide. So, with everything, as I'm educating people who are coming to see me, the things that become important in areas, and Stacey's, really alluded to that, there was something that changed, or there was something that was different. And that becomes probably the most important thing. We all know our bodies pretty well. And I think it's really important to continue to advocate for yourself and to say, this is a change, this is different. Let's address it, let's readdress it. There's other skin cancers that are also aggressive, but thankfully less common. Things like Merkel cell carcinoma, that's the cancer that took Jimmy Buffett's life. And again, there's been many advancements in the field to treat even these types of cancers.
And this is across the board, right? And it doesn't matter what age or what background, everyone can get skin cancer.
That's correct. I think there's a misnomer that people of color or people from Latin, South America, that they cannot get cancer, and that's actually false. Everyone, no matter what your pigmentation is, can get sunburns. Everyone can develop things like squamous cells and basal cells. In fact, last 2 weeks in my clinic, I had 5 patients who grew up in South America, all with new diagnoses of melanoma.
Well, you just mentioned that as a misnomer, and we talked about earlier a little bit about misinformation now that's out there about skin cancer and sunscreen. What do you hear in your office in regards to the misinformation?
So many times there's just a lot of listening going on by the time that someone's reaching me in the office. However, articles that we've been seeing, Stacey had mentioned, things that we're seeing on TikTok that are just frankly false, that are giving people completely wrong information, really are damaging and could undo a lot of the work that's been done over the last 20 years, which is just heartbreaking.
Do you have some examples that you can share with us?
So I think there's a complete misnomer. I think we talked a little bit about that the sunscreen actually causes cancer. And if you think about it, in fact, there was this amazing study that was done and published about 10 years ago where they looked at about 1,600 people in Australia, and they followed them over 10 years. And what they found was in the group of people that actually used their appropriate SPF over 30 sunscreen, they put it on their arms and on their face. Over 10 years, that they were 50% less likely to develop a melanoma. And in fact, none of them developed higher rates of other cancers. So when we talk about misinformation, I think we need to amplify the good information. And I'm not seeing people really amplifying really well done studies like this. and we're amplifying something that maybe began with a shred of truth and a lot of uncertainty. And that's really unfortunate.
Hmm. And I think one of the bigger misnomers I think that we're seeing right now is this idea of a base tan. And when we were talking about the show, it actually reminded me of my own sort of upbringing. It's like, yeah, I remember hearing the idea of a base tan. So can you talk about what is this concept and is there any truth to it?
So when you talk about a base tan, so first of all, every time that you have a tan, what that is representative of sun damage. And again, I'm also a child who grew up in the 90s. And what a tan is when you have cells deeper in the skin called your melanocytes. They make pigment to try to protect you. And if you think about, we put it into terms about SPF, right? So we recommend to use an SPF of at least 30 for your skin. Your quote unquote base tan, otherwise known as your sun damaged skin, only provides an SPF at best of 4 to 6. And what happens then after you have your base tan, that's already damaged skin. So you're actually more susceptible to additional skin damage than what you were before.
And I want to bring Caroline into this conversation. Caroline just reported on sunscreen behavior with the New York Times. And Caroline, you started your story with a survey from the American Academy of Dermatology. Tell us about the survey and some of its findings.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this mention of a base tan was actually one of the sort of striking pieces of misinformation. Nearly a quarter of adults between the ages of 18 to 26 thought that getting a base tan could prevent skin cancer. The American Academy of Dermatology survey was about 1,000 participants. And so, that's obviously not going to reflect the entire generation, but it's a pretty decent sample. And then there was another survey out of Orlando Health that similarly found some pretty striking percentages of young people who believe these sunscreen myths, let's call them. And so in that survey, 14% of adults under 35 thought wearing sunscreen every day is actually more harmful than direct sun exposure. And then, in the American Academy of Dermatology survey, nearly a third thought suntans caused, or that sunscreen caused skin cancer, did not think that suntans cause skin cancer, which, as we were just talking about, like even a suntan is skin damage. So,
right.
It's cumulative. If you're always tan but never burnt, that doesn't mean you're in the clear for skin cancer. In fact, that's also sun damage, even if it's not a burn. There's just a lot. I guess I should caveat this by saying, I'm not of Generation Z, I'm a millennial, but when I was in my early 20s and, teens, I also, and actually, Stacey also had this similar story of being 16 and just loving getting tan, loving getting even burnt, that feeling of, the sun. I think that I say that to sort of like couch this. It's not unique to Gen Z. I think that there's just like sort of a generational thing. Like young people are always going to, be a little bit more inclined to do that sun-seeking behavior because you don't. I think the reason is, and at least from what I heard from sources in reporting this, is like you don't see the skin damage quite as like tangibly when you are younger. When you start to enter your 30s and you see sort of like the photo aging and you're like, oh man, like this is something that I could change. But there's not that immediate effect. When you look in the mirror, when you're 16 years old of
Sure.
having that.
Well, and based on your reporting and all the conversations that you've been having too, and we've mentioned earlier as well that this is definitely very much generational. And with all of the mixed information, sunscreen causes cancer, sun exposure causes cancer, sunscreen prevents skin cancer, or your sunscreen is not strong enough. This is a lot of information for anyone to take in. And you talking about the recent survey that really showed that it seems like this is really impacting behavior around sunscreen. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned, it's not fully unique to Gen Z, but there is something unique about this generation, which, as we mentioned, is this intense proliferation of information, and that could be a positive thing. But also the flip side of that is that there's just so much misinformation at everybody's fingertips, and these myths do proliferate, and they often get more views than the accurate information that's out there. There's a lot of people that call themselves experts who don't have any credentials and are sort of referring to these myths as fact. And people do get a lot of their information online these days, especially younger people, and that does impact their son behavior. In the American Academy of Dermatology survey, actually, I think 37% said they only ever wore sunscreen when, their friends or family nagged them about it. So, that means they're not putting it on every day, which is the recommendation from the American Academy of Dermatology. And most, I think all dermatologists say, sunscreen every single day. You really do need it. Wear it, put it on like brushing your teeth, make it part of your routine. But yeah, a big chunk of people and young adults aren't wearing it unless somebody's telling them they have to.
And Dr. Olino, especially with what Caroline just mentioned with how fast information is traveling on social media, and we talked about earlier that the idea of a base tan is a myth that has really perpetuated over time, and mostly traveling from word of mouth, but now it's traveling through the internet. So in this age of social media, that means this information travels way faster than I think when we were getting this information. What are we seeing about that on social media? What are you seeing, Dr. Olino?
Well, again, there's lots of people who read something and there may be a shred of truth, and then they take it upon themselves to amplify that. And they now can amplify what they misunderstand or have an idea to a greater audience. And I would really love to challenge those people who are doing the videos of skincare and how to get ready in the morning to actually take a minute and actually make a difference and actually reach out to our young people and say, let's pause and let me get my sunscreen on. Could you imagine what could be done for prevention if people who had influence actually used that and did it in a way that could reach thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of followers and actually prevent cancer? We always say, when someone gets to a point that Stacey was, right? And Stacey tells these powerful stories. But imagine if Stacey had gotten a message from media, from magazines when she was younger that really espoused a different ideal. There could be thousands of Staceys that never had to go what she went through.
And Caroline, I want to pivot to a different kind of reach and influence. In July, Senator Richard Blumenthal had asked the FDA to approve more effective ingredients in sunscreens. When should we expect to see that?
So I can't tell you the answer to that. But what I can say, in the conversations I had in reporting on, sunscreen and how the U.S. is sort of unique in the way we regulate it, is that the FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, does regulate sunscreen as a drug instead of as a cosmetic. So, that means that if people want to put the broad spectrum SPF label on their product, they have to submit all sorts of different efficacy and safety tests to the FDA, which are really expensive to conduct and really difficult to conduct and take a long time. So I think that part of this isn't like, I can't speak on behalf of the FDA. I'm just a reporter, but sure. I would say that there's part of it that's just, it's not that the FDA doesn't want new effective ingredients. It just doesn't have the data to bring them through, this lengthy process. And I think there's been some calls to sort of shift the way that FDA does regulate sunscreen. But in other countries, we were talking about like Europe and Korea and some other countries that have these newer, chemical filters in their SPF. In those places, sunscreens are regulated as cosmetics. So, they don't go through the same testing that the FDA would require to regulate them as drugs. And I guess the flip side to this, you can sort of see, like, if you have a sunscreen that's been through FDA testing, you can be really confident that, it's been through, these lengthy testings, and the labels are what they say they are. So that's a positive thing, but it takes a lot longer. It's more expensive. Definitely more expensive for companies.
Right. And we've got about a minute left here, but I do want to ask Caroline for your any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners from your reporting.
Sure. We've talked so much about sunscreen specifically, but something that I sort of heard in chatting with experts for this is that, like, sunscreen isn't your only defense. I mean, it shouldn't be seen as your first defense either. Like, definitely seek out shade. Don't go in the peak sunlight during like 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Wide brimmed hats, we talked about that. There's so many additional things we can do to protect our skin from the sun beyond just sunscreen. But sunscreen is a really important part of that recommendation, and wearing it every day is definitely necessary.
You've been listening to Caroline Hopkins, who's a health and science reporter who recently reported on sunscreen for the New York Times. Caroline, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Dr. Kelly Olino is an assistant professor of surgical oncology at the Yale School of Medicine, and she will be staying with us. And listeners, let us know if you're using sunscreen this summer, or if you have any questions. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about sunscreen. And with us still is Dr. Kelly Olino, who's an assistant professor of surgical oncology at Yale School of Medicine. And Dr. Olino, we want to go back to the basics and ask you some essential questions about sunscreen. This might be a little bit rapid fire, so get ready for this. How waterproof is waterproof sunscreen?
So waterproof sunscreen is really not truly water resistance, and really is only effective in water at best from 40 to 80 minutes. So as soon as you get out of the water, you should be reapplying.
And talk about SPF. We've mentioned this several times, from SPF 2, which blows my mind a little bit, to SPF 50. What does that mean, and how do you pick out the best quality sunscreen for you?
So SPF actually means sun protection factor. It doesn't impact how often or that you should reapply it or how much you should apply. And that's really important. So the example I give people is SPF means how much longer by using sunscreen can you prevent UV damage from causing a sunburn. So an SPF of 30, right, if you spend 20 minutes in the sun, actually would give you about the equivalent of 600 minutes of protection if you were to use nothing at all. So it can be a little confusing when people think about it. Right. But again, the important things are SPF at least of 30 or above, and apply it every 2 hours and more often if you're sweating or going in the water.
And for this conversation, we also reached out to the Environmental Working Group and spoke with David Andrews. He's the Deputy Director of Investigations and Senior Scientist. He talked about how sunscreen ingredients have impacted ocean life. Let's take a listen here.
There are a number of ingredients that have been linked to coral death, and in particular, coral death or coral bleaching in the presence of sunlight and warming environment. And so there's actually a couple studies done in the last few years that shows one of the most common ingredients, oxybenzone, when it's applied to coral, it's not the oxybenzone, but a metabolite of oxybenzone in the coral that actually increases the rate of photobleaching and damage to the corals. Many of the best performing products, the ones that we think are best options from a health perspective, are some of the best options from an environment, marine protection perspective also. So the good news is that there are a significant number of sunscreens that are made with zinc oxide or titanium dioxide. These are the mineral-based sunscreens. They make up the majority of our recommended products. So we've been evaluating sunscreens for just about 18 years and really trying to provide guidance to consumers on the best available products. These are products that don't use concerning ingredients and are expected to provide the best UV protection for what you can get in the US market. And there are hundreds of products that meet this standard and primarily, as I mentioned, use zinc oxide base as the active ingredient.
That was David Andrews. He's the Deputy Director of Investigations and Senior Scientist of the Environmental Working Group. So Dr. Olino, can you respond to what he said here about using mineral-based sunscreens?
So I think mineral-based sunscreens are a really great option. I think they've gotten historically a bad rap because those are a lot of the things that we, the movies of our youth where you'd see the lifeguard with the heavy paste. I think Stacey had alluded to, there's a bunch of newer products on the market, but I will tell you the best sunscreen is the one that you're going to use. And again, making sure that it's dual blockade, so it has to block UVA or B, so it's got to be broad spectrum. So I just think wearing it is important if you want to be environmentally conscious. Again, this is, I think, early data about what it's doing to the coral reefs and marine animals like clams. So, if that's something that you really, really is important to you, again, there's really great options for that too.
And we also talked about earlier how I think more people are going to see a dermatologist, but that can be expensive. So is getting access to the doctor's office an issue here?
I think for a lot of people it is. And many times the patients that I'm seeing with advanced disease that come to my office, and I see this every single week, had difficulty accessing care. I will say that there's lots of other ways. If you think that you have a skin cancer, again, even that messaging when you're calling to get an appointment with your primary care doctor or you're coming in, we diagnose melanoma sometimes even in the emergency department. So if there's something that you're concerned about, just come in and see us. We'll figure it out.
Well, and Stacey also described that it was really hard to just get a diagnosis. It took her 8 years and 3 different doctors to really reach that conclusion. Is that experience common?
Fortunately, no. And, I think Stacey really had a very, very unique experience. But the thing that's really important is in order to make the diagnosis, you need a biopsy because it's a diagnosis that's made underneath a microscope by a pathologist. And it's very, very difficult to the naked eye to see the difference between an atypical mole, a non-invasive melanoma, or a melanoma. I think basals and squamous cells, dermatologists and primary care doctors do a really great job at detecting those. And again, those thankfully have less of a propensity to spread than other types of skin cancer.
So I got about a minute here, but I have a kind of a big question for you still. But what do we know about skin cancer and demographics? Are certain demographics more likely to get skin cancer than others?
Yeah, so there's a whole classification system called the Fitzpatrick scale. And again, people who are redhead, lighter skin, lighter eye color, they are much, much more prone to getting skin cancer than someone who has much darker pigment and may come from an equatorial region, for example.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dr. Olino. We will have to have you back on to give us more guidance on how to use sunscreen and understand how to use it better. You've been listening to Dr. Kelly Olino, who's an assistant professor of surgical oncology at Yale School of Medicine. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible, and our technical producer is Bradley O'Connor. A big shout out to our director of storytelling and radio programming, Katie Tolarski. Katie joined our organization in 2006, and tomorrow is her last day. We love her so much here on Where We Live, and we will also miss her very, very much indeed. Thank you so much for listening, and join us in wishing her all the best.